In the verses right before our passage, verses 1 to 10, Paul actually urges Titus to instruct all believers in their Christian duty. He speaks to old and young men, speaks to old and young women, speaks to slaves. And then in verse 11, he provides the very basis for these instructions. And so essentially what he's saying to them is, yes, conduct yourselves in these ways, and here's why. Verse 11. For, or because the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. And so Paul, he's referring to the coming of Jesus Christ as your Savior, which is why this passage is traditionally read at Christmas time. You know, in Luke 1:79, the same word for appeared is used to describe Jesus' birth as the shining of God's light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. But as we look at this verse, let me clarify a few things. First, Paul isn't saying that God wasn't gracious before the coming of Christ. But what he is saying is that God's grace became manifest in the incarnation of his Son. God's grace was made effective in the saving work that Jesus performed. And then second, Paul isn't saying that all people will be saved whether they believe or not. No, he's saying that salvation has been offered to all kinds of people, not just some. In other words, anyone can be saved by believing the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And so through Jesus' life, through his death, through his resurrection and his ascension into heaven, Christ has brought salvation for all who believe in him. And so what we're seeing in this very first sentence is that Paul grounds godliness not in the believer's resolution, not in the believer's will. No, he grounds it in the free gift of God's grace. Paul explains his call to godliness not by placing it in opposition to grace. No, he places godliness precisely in light of God's grace. And so in contrast to the legalist who tries to earn their salvation by their good works, Paul says, no. We live godly lives in joyful response to the grace that we've received. As Paul famously states later in chapter 3, verses 4 to 6, and that Tyler actually read for us earlier, it says, when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, he saved us. Not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy. And so what we're seeing here in verse 11 is that God's past grace is the basis of our godliness. It's the grounds of our godliness.